In the early 90s, the mascot craze was everywhere. Sega had Sonic, Nintendo had Mario, and the TurboGrafx 16 had Bonk. However, he just didn't say on the TurboGrafx 16, "Hey, I am the Game Collector, and this is Second Opinion Games." And today, we compare Bonk on the Nintendo versus Bonk on the TurboGrafx 16.
Second Opinion Games.
Bonk quickly became the mascot of the TurboGrafx 16, and he had some success on that platform, spawning multiple sequels. However, the original Bonk's Adventure also received ports on other systems, like the Nintendo and the Game Boy alike. Why is this? Well, the developers, Red Company and Atlas, they weren't really making that much money here in the States off of Bonk, even though he was very popular in Japan. So, we got him. The Nintendo cartridge is super rare, and the Game Boy cartridge also rare, but doesn't fetch such a high price. On the Game Boy here, the game plays a lot what you would expect Bonk to play like. It's very ugly in colors. The music is pretty good, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. And the game plays excellent. On the TurboGrafx 16, we have the original. Super great graphics, super good music, and an overall classic. So you might be thinking, it's really not fair to compare these two games. The TurboGrafx 16 has two 8-bit processors making a 16-bit system, and the Game Boy can barely play NES ports. Well, you're right. That's why I'm also comparing this super rare NES version in this review. The NES version, though a very good port, also had a couple of minor changes. For one, the music isn't as good, and that's really not its fault, because the chipset on the NES wasn't as good as the chipset on the TurboGrafx, and they tried to port it 1-to-1 over, which didn't translate well. They probably would have had a much better job just using what the Nintendo had under its horsepower and create a whole new themes. The Game Boy, this translated, well, better than what you might think, and it sounds pretty good as well. The TurboGrafx, of course, it sounded amazing. Their chipset tunes are terrific, and it's standout classic. So let's compare graphics now. Okay, the Nintendo port. It looks pretty plain, and there is quite a few differences from level to level in this port. Basically, they pulled it over and did whatever they could using the limitations of the system to quite a good effect. It's really not as flashy as the TurboGrafx 16 version, but it does look very well. Take the first stage, for instance. On the first stage, you could run through it from start to finish, and you don't really notice anything super special about it. In the TurboGrafx version, you see bright, colorful plants, lots of different colors being used because the color palette was far more varied on the TurboGrafx, and the moon in the background as a bit of foreshadowing and some other graphical effects that seem to just work better on the TurboGrafx 16. On the Game Boy version, it's just kind of plain because it's the Game Boy, and too much stuff going on screen at once would make the game crash or run into severe slowdown, which this game on the Game Boy doesn't really have that much slowdown, maybe only in some of the water stages later on in the game. Overall, very solid in graphics on all three games though. Gameplay almost identical here. Bonk smashes stuff with his head. He could either rain death from above or just a standing simple headbutt. He eats meat to power up. He gains hearts to fill his heart meter, or sometimes fruits and vegetables, points to get an extra life, and there's tons of hidden stuff along the way, including warp zones to different levels where you could have a chance to earn lives. It is a lot easier to earn lives in the game for the NES, but I think that was a change that they made for the better. although it can make the game a little bit too easy. The TurboGrafx, relatively difficult. The control moving left and right doesn't feel as precise as the NES, but the NES one really doesn't feel that precise either. The Game Boy actually feels the best in tight controls, and even that is a little bit wonky. He sort of glides around just a little bit. His jumps aren't as precise as Mario, but this wasn't intended to be another Mario. This is a whole new brand. So before I even get too far into this, I want to look at some of the levels in the game. First of all, what does Bonk do really, really right? Well, it does water levels right. Matter of fact, this game does it really right, because Bonk is more maneuverable when he's in the water than when he's just on land. You could use the D-pad to push up and down, so you don't have to continuously hit the jump button to swim. Bonk has infinite breath, so he doesn't die like some type of wimpy hedgehog under the water after a couple seconds. So Bonk is fully maneuverable, and the game takes advantage of this to have some really challenging levels and obstacles in his way. Except on the Game Boy version, which you could just swim past everything, and the water levels pretty much don't even need to exist. Matter of fact, a lot of the Game Boy's levels are super easy, where you can just run to the right and you win, because it didn't really throw a whole lot of enemies at you. But the Nintendo and TurboGrafx versions, both filled with enemies, lots of spikes and tight quarters to maneuver your way around, and maybe even find yourself inside of a dinosaur where you're swimming in its blood or stomach acids or something before you eventually come out the other end. Haha. When you're on this very short stage on the back of this little dinosaur, well, you could see on the TurboGrafx the spikes come up very, very quick, and they're smaller with more precise jumps. On the NES version, well, they're huge freaking spikes. Game Boy doesn't have this part whatsoever, so forget about it. Also, much later in the game, the Nintendo version has a huge tower that you have to scale to go up and up and up. The TurboGrafx 16 version has some incredibly hard jumping. And seeing that I talked about Bonk really isn't the best at jumping earlier in this review, you could find out that this section is really, really hard. Not because there's really any enemies here, but because it's really hard to control Bonk. It's kind of frustrating, and I'm really glad they actually removed this part of the game, instead throwing in some more challenging levels and challenging gameplay in the Nintendo version. So, one up on Nintendo here. Now it's time to get into some serious business here, and that's the boss battles. These are some of the most shining moments of the TurboGrafx 16. Bonk's bosses are pretty insane, including this huge dinosaur, where Bonk just bashes his head, and there's no way the Nintendo can pull off a sprite this big and accurate, even though it is really easy on the TurboGrafx version. Oh wait, they did! Look at this! It's freaking huge and made more challenging on the Nintendo. That's pretty crazy. Unfortunately, this is the only boss battle that I'm impressed with Nintendo for. It is probably the largest sprite I've ever seen in the Nintendo universe. The Game Boy games, well, they threw all the bosses out the window. Almost. They did keep the last two about the same, and created all new ones to fit the hardware better because it couldn't handle the large sprites that the TurboGrafx and Nintendo could never do large sprites very well, but, I mean, it did it somewhat. So looking at some of these other bosses, and the Nintendo and the TurboGrafx have them all, and they're all still here, and they look and play great. Predictable patterns that you will soon learn and figure out how to take them out. Each one is a little bit different in its own sense, and I'm not going to say any is easier than the other. Of course, when you come to the end of game and you have to have a huge boss rush, I will say the Nintendo version is far easier because in between every single segment here is usually a little bit of health, maybe even some meat to help you along. On the TurboGrafx version, nope, it's pretty much just one boss after another, and hopefully you saved up enough lives as you played through the game to beat this section to move on. Now, I'm pretty sure all 3 games have infinite continues. However, for the Nintendo, I didn't use a single continue the entire time, and this was my first time playing through the game. On the TurboGrafx, also, believe it or not, my first time playing through the game, and I used 1 continue towards the end. The Game Boy version, I played this quite a bit when I first got it, a couple years ago, and I didn't use a single continue until I got to the last boss of the game, which I just couldn't figure out where his weak spot was, and I used a ton of continues before I ended up beating the game. So I know for a fact, infinite continues there. Playing through it again for this review, I used 1 continue, yet again, because I was dumb and died a whole lot when I really shouldn't have, but that's a whole nother thing altogether. Okay, so let's go through all the differences real quick and figure out which one's better and which one's not, and finally set this to bed. Also, at the end of the video, I'm going to show the ending sequence to the game, so you guys don't really have to play through it. So, spoiler alert, just getting out of the way right now. Okay, in the sound department, obvious winner, TurboGrafx 16, second place going to Game Boy, and last place going to Nintendo, because they really just didn't do a good job here. Gameplay, Bonk's Adventure on the TurboGrafx 16 is the best. Nintendo and Game Boy share in a tie because they're both actually pretty good. They do seem to be missing some levels from the original game, but that's okay because they did their own thing and added some other stuff too. So, tied there. Graphics department, clear winner. I mean, it is using 2 8-bit processors to be able to pull off some effects. TurboGrafx obviously has it. The other 2 games, given their limitations, they did a great job. Matter of fact, given the overall limitations of the Game Boy, this is very graphically impressive for the system, so I kind of have to give it the edge over the original Nintendo. Difficulty-wise, Bonk's Adventure for the TurboGrafx, absolutely great. It is a little bit on the easy side, but all 3 games are. The secrets are hidden really, really well, though, in order to do good in the TurboGrafx, forcing you to explore around. Matter of fact, most of the secrets in this game I would not have found if they didn't put them in the same place as they did for the original Nintendo, where the secrets were right out in the open for everyone to freaking see. So, again, I give the difficulty, learning curve, much better on Bonk's Adventure than on the Nintendo and Game Boy. Overall score, Bonk's Adventure for the TurboGrafx 16. Definitely have to pick it up. It's a winner. Game Boy comes in second place here because it doesn't cost $500 like the NES version of this game. So, there you have it. No matter which one you have, you win. They're all terrific games, and they all play great. But if you really just have to get only one, and really, who has to get only one Bonk? Go with the TurboGrafx 16 version. It is maybe not the original, because I think there was an arcade version out there, but it is the best home console version of the game. But that's just my opinion. Thanks for watching. Well, I hoped you liked these Bonk games, so please leave me a message. I want to know how you felt about Bonk and which one you thought was the best. Also, if you want to know more about Bonk for the GameCube, make sure you look at my top 10 import GameCube games. And until later, I'll see you again, guys.